British Dyslexia Association hosted Ask the Expert session. We thought it was a good time considering the difficulties we are experiencing and hopefully coming out of, with a view to, as we go into our summer term with the exams that are looming and trying to guide our children through a very difficult education journey at the moment, that we bring together some experts for you to ask questions and to share their expertise for a little while. So it gives me great pleasure then to welcome our experts, and I'll run through who we have this evening. So we start with Gillian Ashley. So Gillian is the Chief Development Officer here at the British Dyslexia Association. She is a qualified teacher, primary, secondary and at university level. She's a dyslexia specialist and she holds a Master's in Psychology, as well as, of course, being part of the BDA team. And then it's great to have Helen Goodsall with us this evening. She is Knowledge and Information Manager here at the BDA. One of her main roles is to develop evidence-based information across our organisation, and she's a parent of 2 dyslexic children. She's a workplace needs assessor and has worked at BDA Helpline, so it's great to have her with us as well. And that brings me on to Malcolm. So good evening, Malcolm. So Malcolm Nissen, he has a background of over 40 years as an English teacher, and since the 1990s, he's introduced assistive technology in the college that he worked at, so he's a real expert in that way as well. His college was recognised by the government for its excellence, and he's currently a tutor at Bath Spa University. He's also produced an app called Phoneme Reader, and he's part of the BDA's technology committee, so he's here to advise on assistive technology. And that brings me on to Caroline Reid, also known as Lina, but we refer to her as Caroline this evening. Good evening, Caroline.
Hi.
She is a specialist teacher, who has lots of practical experiences in all areas of access arrangements. And she trains local authorities and universities and SEN services. She is the founder and a senior course tutor at Communicate Ed, so she represents that organisation with us this evening. And her book, Assessment Guidance for Access Arrangements, was published by GL Assessments. So that brings me, last but certainly not least, to Jeff Hughes. Hi, Jeff.
Hello
Jeff
there.
is an educational psychologist. He is an assistive technologist in private practice, and he's also the North West Regional Local Dyslexia Association representative and helpliner. So we are in very safe hands this evening with our expert. It's lovely to draw together everybody. Just to remind you all that we are recording this evening, so please do shut down your camera and place yourself on mute if you don't want to be shown in that way. I will open the chat box because tonight is all about asking our experts. So while you have a think about the questions you wish to submit, I'm just going to do a bit of a round robin, if that's okay, with our experts, just to get your sense, everybody, of where you think we're at now, what's to come in these very uncertain times, and why you think this evening is a good time to start thinking about the guidance that we need as parents and educators. So Helen, if I may start with you.
So I think it's all very uncertain. We've certainly had lots of calls from parents on the helpline asking us what's going to happen this year. We know the government have announced exams have been cancelled and that they're going to be replaced by teacher assessed grades. And from the guidance that's been published, we know that the schools will have a certain amount of flexibility on how they provide the evidence for those grades. So some students might be sitting the exams, some may be just based on coursework. What the schools have been asked to do is to come up with a policy, and that needs to be published, and they probably, if they haven't already done so, they're working on them over the Easter holidays. So where there is uncertainty at the moment, hopefully when people return next term, they should have more clarity on what their individual school will be doing. But it really remains to be seen what the impact is on people and whether dyslexic children will be more advantaged or disadvantaged or not over this summer's exams.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. That's a great overview, I think. So, Caroline, may I come to you next as an overview of where we're at, really, or you think some of the issues?
Yeah, I was very pleased that as a result of the consultation, Ofqual and the Department for Education have been very clear that any student who qualifies for access arrangements and reasonable adjustments should have those in any mock exams that they've done or if they do the optional tests from the awarding bodies, that they should be done with access arrangements. So if they qualify for a reader, they should have a reader. If they're allowed extra time, they should have that extra time in those assessments. And where teachers are looking at other evidence, they should keep in mind what the student would have been able to do with the help of their access arrangements. So I think that was really positive out of the consultation, from the suggestion of a number of colleagues I know. So I was really pleased to see that.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. And Malcolm, same question to you. Can you summarise where you think we're at the moment, what's to come?
Okay, evening everyone. I would suggest that we're in a very complicated situation as far as access to assistive technology is concerned. It's complex enough for schools to provide this in the examination room, but the reality at the moment, I think, is going to be in many schools that assessments are done on and off in the next 2, maybe even 3 months, and that providing the technology in the right place at the right time in, say, an English lesson that's taking place in several classrooms, but they're all being assessed, is going to be an even bigger challenge. And I think if you're a parent, if you're the candidate yourself, or if you're a teacher, then there is going to be the need for a little bit more insistence. I'm entitled to this, I must be given it.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. Which brings me on to Jeff. Jeff, any thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I think I'm going to emphasise what Malcolm has just said, and that is the need to emphasise, to communicate, and to insist with the schools. They are going to be under intolerable pressures at the moment. It's not a situation that any teacher would like to be in, because it's new, it's different, and you still got to do all the things that you're supposed to do. So parents have had a period of time with their children, and as a result of that, they now know much more about the way their children function in the learning situation. And certainly, my experience of the helpline questions I'm getting is that they are acutely aware of the difficulties, a lot more sympathetic to teachers than they perhaps have been in the past, but baffled at the moment as to what can be done. So my one message is it's not too late, because whatever goes on in school now is going to be assessed. Teachers are going to do various kinds of activities. They're going to watch, they're going to observe, they're going to record what people have done, and it's therefore important that at this moment the school becomes aware of the difficulties a child has, even if they've not known about them before or recognized them before. So get talking to schools. Don't just say they'll do it. They won't, not because they're not willing, but because they've actually got so much on their hands at the moment. We're trying to catch up at the moment on so many things, and certain people would now be saying, thank heavens we're not doing the exams, because exams are not necessarily the best way of assessing things. But nor is pure teacher assessment likely to be absolutely spot on. It's an art, and you've got to be there giving them the information.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeff, and thank you to all the experts. So we now go to our questions. So as I said, the chat box is open. Please put your thoughts in there. And we already start with some. So this first question is to you, Caroline. My school said my son needs to be tested for access arrangements for his GCSEs next year, but I do not really understand what this means and what will happen. Do I have to pay for this test? Can you help me, please?
Okay. It's unlikely that you would have to pay for the test, particularly if you're in a state school. Sometimes independent schools may have some way of charging for an assessment, but it should really be free. All it means is that perhaps a teacher, one of your your son's teachers has commented that he works a bit more slowly than his peers, or perhaps needs some reading help, or has difficulty writing. And great that they've picked that up. And then what they will do if they've noticed that students are needing help in the classroom, they will recommend that they see a specialist teacher who will do an assessment with them to see whether they've got scores that show not just that they seem to be a bit slow, but we actually have to have proof from standardised scores which show very clearly that compared to the rest of the population of that age, that those students do work slowly or do have difficulty with spelling or writing. And then once that test has been done, if the scores are low enough, the SENCO can make an application through an online system. The Joint Council for Qualifications are the body that put together the regulations about this, and they oversee the access arrangements online system. Basically, the JCQ, the Joint Council for Qualifications, represents the main awarding bodies, the awarding bodies that offer GCSE and A-level functional skills, etc. And so an application would be made by the SENCO through the access arrangements online system. And if your son or daughter meets the criteria, then they will get permission to be allowed to have extra time, or perhaps a reader or a scribe writing for them, or maybe use of a word processor. So the system is meticulously put together to make sure that it's fair, that students who don't work more slowly than their peers don't get extra time. Of course, that would be completely unfair if someone who works at the normal rate were given extra time, they would get an unfair advantage. The whole point of access arrangements is to remove a disadvantage. So that's what your SENCO and the specialist assessor will be looking to do, to check that your son or daughter is genuinely disadvantaged. And by putting an access arrangement in place, we're trying to level the playing field. But we wouldn't want to be giving access arrangements unless the student is genuinely disadvantaged.
Thank you, Caroline. That's a great answer. The next question, which I think is probably one for Gillian. Who decides which children should have access arrangements in their exams, and how do they decide what they should do?
Thanks, Donna. So quite a lot of overlap with what Caroline's just said, but I'll try to give it in a little bit of a different way. So in reality, it should be a collaborative process with the school, the parents and the child. And initially that process might be started by the school, because they might have noticed some difficulties that the child is experiencing. And that could be something which is around processing of information, reading or writing. And they will also probably use their own tracking information and observations to identify that there is a disadvantage for the child. So at that point, I would say the school should then discuss this with the parents and the child, and any arrangements such as having some extra time should be then put in place in their lessons, so that they begin to establish that access arrangement as the child's normal way of working. And then the next part of that process really is they have to then have an assessment, and as Caroline has said, that should be free, it should be provided by the school. So the school might have somebody within their school staff who's a specialist assessor, and they might then assess the child to see if that child meets the JCQ regulations for that arrangement. And it should be an arrangement which is suggested by the school to meet the child's need, and that should be something which is already established as their normal way of working. And then if they meet the JCQ threshold, they qualify to have that arrangement in their examinations. So it's not a straightforward answer, but it should be one which is a collaborative process. Families should be involved at all stages of that, and so should the child, because really, as Caroline has said, it is about levelling that playing field, and we want to make sure that they get the right access arrangement for the need that they have.
Thank you, Gillian. And I wonder, for the individuals who've asked those questions, if they want to find out more, are we suggesting BDA helpline, Or where
Yeah,
could they go
definitely.
to find out more, Gillian and Caroline?
Definitely PDA helpline. We've
Yep.
also put on our website a fact sheet for parents, so do have a look on the BDA website. You can even actually have a look at the JCQ regulations yourself, because it is a PDF document that you can download and have a read of. So if there are any parents that are interested, you know, have a read through it, and it's quite an in-depth document that takes you through how things work. So if you're interested to that level, you might want to do that.
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks, Gillian. Caroline, did you want to add anything there?
Yes, if you want to track that down, if you just put JCQ access arrangements and reasonable adjustments into Google, you'll find the document. It's not an easy read. It'll good bedtime reading. It'll send you to sleep.
Definitely.
but it's a well thought out document, and yes, it certainly does try to make things fair across different centres.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks to you both. Malcolm, I think this next question may be for you. My son uses a text reader and dictation software on his laptop in class and at home. He's doing his GCSEs next year, but I wanted to know if he will be able to use these things in all of his exams.
Okay, the very simple answer would be yes, but on the kind of conditions that you've just been listening to. So just because your son uses technology, that doesn't guarantee the right to use it in the exam. Though I would like to just introduce one point, which I don't think is implemented very widely at all. I wonder how widely it's actually known, and that is that JCQ now states quite clearly that if someone's normal way of working is to use a word processor, then they should be given that word processor. There's a kind of new emphasis on school having an obligation here, rather than it just being, oh, well, if we can, we will, but it's a bit complicated, so sorry, no, we won't be, which is quite commonly the treatment that individuals get where schools are finding it all a bit too much to cope with. In terms of the phrase that you've heard, normal way of working, I would also like to stress that that does not mean that in every lesson, at every opportunity, the individual is working in this way. Again, JCQ makes it abundantly clear that what they mean is this is an established way of working. And I wish they would use that word instead. I have had a conversation with them where I said, if I say I normally go to work by bus, then you would be surprised to find me going to work by any other way. And therefore, a lot of places assume that if you say it's his normal way of working, that somehow means he's nearly always working that way. But JCQ have made it very clear that, for example, if your son used the dictation software in the mock exam and in other school exams, then that would be a normal way of working, which is therefore acceptable in the GCSE exam itself. It doesn't mean that every lesson, every time someone says, I want you to write something, he immediately goes into working in that way.
Thank you, Malcolm. Really interesting. Jeff, I think this next question.
Oh,
yes, please do, Caroline. Yes, no, please do.
The issue of a reader is fairly straightforward now. It used to be, up until recently, that you had to have a below average score in a reading test to be able to have a reader or a computer reader. But that's been sort of softened, really. And now we just need to show that it's the normal way of working, whether we agree with that phrase or not. So if your son or daughter uses a text reader, or what the JCQ would refer to as a computer reader, and then they in class, in the centre, and then they should be allowed to use that. Dictation software is a little bit more difficult because you have to show that you either work particularly slowly, your handwriting is illegible, or your spelling is very difficult to read before you can have dictation software. As Malcolm explained, using a word processor is a little bit more open than that, but actually dictation software is considered to be the same as dictating to a scribe, to a human being. So they're a bit more strict about that.
Thank you. Thanks to you both. The next question then, I think could start with Jeff. It says, I paid for my daughter to be assessed for dyslexia and the report said she should have extra time in exams. Her school says that they cannot use this private report. What should I do to make sure she gets extra time in her GCSEs?
Right, I'm going to say that I know that Lina will have something to say about this one. Because she knows the regulations inside out and has discussed them many times. However, my personal view on that is an assessment of dyslexia, whether it's done by a specialist teacher with qualifications or by a psychologist, is something that a school would be very foolish to ignore. Because the professional who's given that assessment, given that report, should know what they're talking about. So unless the school has got some really solid evidence against it, they really should be taking notice of it. However, it is a matter, and I think Lina will speak about this, it is a matter of regulation that there should be a relationship between the person who does the assessment report and that school, because the circumstances of the school are very important. You can't just give a blanket on any of these things, as it keeps coming out. So I think, and the circumstances of making that relationship are a bit moot in some respects. But at the end of the day, if the school is not following the advice that is there, the evidence that's there, they are actually probably verging on guilty of professional malpractice. And there is, in fact, some comment instruction in the JCQ guidance which points to this. So this is a perennial hot potato about whether private reports are acceptable. There is actually in law no difference between a report that has been commissioned by the school from a qualified person and a report that's been commissioned by the parents. And in fact, these days, the number of local authority psychologists is vanishingly small, and we're mostly working independently now anyway. So in terms of getting the extra time, the case has got to be on the basis of need. And, if you have some evidence of that need, whether it is just a report or whether it is observations of the child functioning in the classroom or indeed in examinations, all of that has to be taken into account. Lina?
Yes, so your school is right, really, that if a report, if a parent commissioned a report without any reference to the school, that would be in contravention of the JCQ requirements. Unfortunately, if they had a conversation, if there'd been a conversation between the SENCO and the assessor before the assessment was carried out, actually that could be accepted. So it's really important that schools communicate properly with parents, because I'm sure had you known that, you perhaps would have arranged the assessor to contact the SENCO to have a conversation in advance. And as Jeff quite rightly said, the regulations do make very clear that if you receive a report, and I've been in this position often when I was based in a school, that I would often get a report commissioned by a parent, saying this student's dyslexic, they should have extra time, etc. I would always take that very seriously and look at it. But if there'd been no contact between the centre and the specialist, a specialist teacher or educational psychologist in advance of the assessment, I would have had to have started again and reassessed. So I'm a specialist teacher, I'm qualified to carry out assessments. So it's just an extra bit of work there. So your school is right in saying they can't accept that report. They could have accepted it had the conversation taken place in advance. but they should certainly take into account what that report says. And from my point of view, that would then prompt me to look at what areas the specialist has picked up and do some further assessment so that I can make an application on that basis.
Of course,
Can I just
the school has to take note of it. They can't block an assessment because they don't agree that there's a need for the assessment. So, I mean, they'd be caught under the other regulation, which is, you know, they have to behave in a professional manner.
I was just going to add to that as well, just to say that it doesn't really make the report void, because that's a really important piece of information. And so what the school can do is use that report as part of the picture of need. So it may not be the qualifying factor. So as Lina has said, you would go on to do tests at the school, but it is an important document which would be part of what the school would be using to provide evidence of that need.
Yeah, it's a cooperative operation. This it's one where parents and schools should be working together, and if you're not, then I think there's other things you need to do.
Yeah. Thank you, experts. The next question I'm going to throw open to you all, and hopefully you figure out who it sits with best. My dyslexic son has found remote learning very hard to learn, focus and concentrate. I want to know whether schools' policies can take account of learning difficulties when giving GCSE grades this year. So experts, who would like to start with this?
Could I?
Yes, Jeff, please do.
The whole issue of children's characteristics is a major issue, and the point about the access arrangements, the Equality Act and all of this is that people should have the kind of support and provision that is appropriate for them. If the child is having problems with attention, then as a matter of course within the school they should be taking account of it. If they're taking account of it within the school, they must take account of it in examinations and assessments, whether they are formal assessments or examinations or whatever. So I think, you know, this is one which is caught by the usual ways of working. These things should be taken into account.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other comments from our experts on that one? No? Are we okay? So we move on to the next question. Caroline, I think this may be one for you. What will happen if my son's self-isolating and misses his teacher set assessments? Can he take them later?
That'll be a case for each individual school to look at, I think. I don't know whether any of the other experts could comment on that. So the assessments I assume that you're speaking about there's some optional assessments that the awarding bodies are giving to schools to use, and they're not exams. Some of the press have called them mini exams, but Ofqual and the awarding bodies are very keen to say they're not mini exams. They're actually very different, because teachers are allowed to choose questions that they have covered, because of course one of the issues of COVID has meant that not all schools have been able to cover the whole of the syllabus. So they're able to pick subjects that they've covered for those students. They're not all done on the same day. We all know that the awarding bodies bend over backwards to make sure that papers are secure. They're not opened until half an hour before the exam starts, and that's not going to be the case this year. The papers will be out there, and I'm sure there'll be some, you know, kids texting each other or whatever kids do these days to let them know what questions have come up. It's going to be very, very different. So I think I would just have to say that it's up to your school to make a decision whether perhaps they may have enough evidence from mock exams, from coursework that your son has done, and he may not need to do the assessments that have been set by the awarding bodies. So without actually knowing the individual case and the way your school would deal with it, I don't think it's possible really to give any more information on that. I don't know whether anyone else feels there's more to add.
I would have.
The word reasonable is the word that matters. Whatever the school does has to be reasonable, has to be seen as reasonable, and if it's not, then that's the time to start asking questions. Sorry, Helen.
I was just going to say, as Lina said, it really will depend, I think, on individual cases and whether they've got enough evidence without that assessment to actually arrive at a grade for that child.
Thank you for that, everyone. The next question. I'm a SENCO and I'm really confused as to what I should do if I have a child isolating. So it's another question about isolation at exam time, particularly regarding their access arrangements. So Gillian, I don't know if this one's, we start with you maybe on this. So a SENCO who's confused about if a child is isolating at exam time regarding any access arrangements.
I think it's really a repeat of what's been said, I suppose. Yeah. And yeah, it is about establishing, obviously, if they're isolating, are they well enough anyway? So, you know, there's a health question over the child at that particular point. And then I suppose if the school decide with the parents that they're not well enough, then it is around having enough evidence to bring all of that together to, as Helen said, arrive at a grade. It's a really tricky question in so much as we've never been in this situation before. And, you know, I think schools are really trying very, very hard to pull everything together, but they're going to have their own individual circumstances. And, you know, I think communication with parents is really key. So what they decide and having that dialogue with parents to alleviate anxiety, because we're bound to have children who are isolating. So, you know, it's really for schools to communicate out to parents in advance that this is what happens if that's the situation for your child. And I think, you know, that gives knowledge to parents, then they don't get worried that actually if this suddenly happens and I find myself in a situation with my child, what's going to happen? They will know in advance what the school is saying. So it's about urging schools really to make those decisions and make them known to parents.
Thanks, Gillian. Any other expert like to chip in on that one before we move on? No? Okay, thank you. So then we've got, my daughter uses a coloured overlay in class. Will she be able to use this in her exams? Who'd like to start answering that one for us?
She certainly should be able to use them in exams. There's no need to apply for permission for that. It just is something that the school can put in place. And if that's the normal way of working, the JCQ would expect her to be able to have access to that.
Thanks, Caroline. So that's, I think, a pretty straightforward one. Anyone like to add anything to what Caroline said? No? I mean, okay.
The only issue,
Jeff.
I was going to say the only issue on that one is one which I suppose I could have brought up on the last one, and that is we're in new territory here in terms of remote working, remote assessment, remote working, you know, remote observations and all the rest of it, and getting the resources, the overlays and such like to a child who is not in school may be a technical and physical challenge. And, you know, I think it's best endeavours. It's, you know, is what is being done reasonable, and have people use their best endeavours, and conversations between the participants, family, you know, school teachers and others has got to be the way forward. There's no rules. There's no rules that can be set out to absolutely cover all of these things.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
As I said, I think schools are being urged that if an access arrangement wasn't in place because it wasn't feasible to put it in at the last minute, that they should either note that on the information that goes through with the grade, or they should try and use other evidence to show how that child performs and exclude that particular piece of work. But again, as Jeff said, it will, you know, be really what happens at the time. We'll have to wait and see.
And Helen, if we've got parents who are confused as the time draws nearer to exams and so on, I guess we're recommending they reach out to a BDA helpline for these types of questions. Yeah. Yes,
I mean, BDA helpline will sort of keep abreast of changes as things change as we go through the next couple of months. And if we hear more, then obviously we'll pass that on.
Yeah. And we
If
may,
I-
experts, need another pop-up session like this one. Who knows?
Yeah, a reminder. If I might
Jeff,
just on
did you
that
want to
point,
say something? Yeah.
yeah, I was just going to jump in, and the BDA has its central helpline, which I think is well known. But if people go onto the BDA's website and look at the local associations, and we have a network of them around the country, every local association runs a helpline. And they have specialist knowledge of what's going on in their area, or they should have. And indeed, your questions will give them extra information, so that's good. So, if the helpline is too busy, if you can't get through, if it's an evening, because a lot of local associations work in evenings, try your local dyslexia association's helpline. Please don't ring everybody, but ring the one nearest to you, please, and ask them, because they will have access to the recording of this if they're not physically with us now, and they have access to the BDA's websites and all the rest of the information that we have. So let's share it a little bit. The central helpline is there at the times it's there. The local helplines are there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And it's all part of the BDA family in that way. So before we say goodbye this evening, I have a slide that hopefully I can share, technology permitting, with a link to what Jeff's talking about, our local associations, with link to Central Helpline as well at BDA, and also the JCQ link that Gillian, I think, mentioned earlier, and to Communicate Ed, our friends over there that Caroline joins us from this evening. And if there's any tech questions, I said at the beginning, Malcolm is part of the BDA's technology committee. Please send them through to BDA helpline, and they can send on to all our fantastic experts there, like Malcolm. And coming to you, I've got another question for you, Malcolm, if that's okay. It is, my son struggles to read, so what help can he have with reading in exams? Someone told me there is a pen that can read questions. Any advice, Malcolm?
Yes, the scanning pens that are available on the market have a rather specialist function. So I'd want to say that's one way to go, but not necessarily the best. It depends on the difficulties the individual faces. So to start with the pens, there are two different versions. There's the normal version, which will have a dictionary available. And so if you scan a word, you use it like a pen, you drag it across a word that you're not sure about, and the pen will then tell you through your ear what that word is. If that still doesn't mean much to you, you can then ask the dictionary for an explanation. However, in the exams, that is not permitted. So there are exam versions of the scanning pen, and it's slimmed down to it will read you text that you scan with the pen. Now, why I say that won't suit everyone is because the technology does not really give you helpful access to lengthy pieces of text. If you imagine scanning along a line with your pen and the sentence doesn't finish there, it goes on in the next line, there's no way of making the pen say, hang on a minute, I want to scan a bit more, and move it to the next line. So you would have to break the sentence up to listen to it. And that clearly becomes rather difficult to follow and a bit clumsy. And so my recommendation with the pen is it is a really good piece of technology for those who need help with individual words when they're reading and they find some word difficult, a drag across it, a listen to it, and they're on to the next bit of the sentence. So in those circumstances, it's a really nifty piece of software and technology. I would recommend its use. However, if the truth is that the individual is struggling to understand text in a wider sense, then this is not really your answer. And then we're talking about the use of text-to-speech software, which is now so widely available. It's actually lovely as an advisor to be able to just say, what have you got? And it's almost certainly built in. So if you use Google Docs or you use Microsoft Word, it's built in, it's there. And you don't have to go buying extra things. And it's permitted in the exams we've already talked about, in what context. One little context that I'd like to emphasize in case anyone's not aware of it is that in the English language GCSE exam, the human reader, which is permitted in all other exams, has to shut up. They aren't allowed to read the passage that maybe the candidate is being asked to understand and answer questions on. And the reason is fair enough. I challenge any reader to read that in a way that didn't kind of assist with understanding. It's almost humanly impossible to do it. However, a computer reader is permitted in those circumstances. So the candidate is not left saying, but I can't really understand this, so I can't do well in this exam. They can have a computer reader if they are normally permitted a reader. So going back to the assessment and the reasons why someone might be given a reader, if they normally are allowed a reader, then they can have a computer reader in the English exam, and they really, really should have a computer reader in that context, because this is one of the key qualifications that determine your right to go on to all sorts of other vocational and academic courses post 16.
Thank you, Malcolm. And again, if anybody's got any further questions about technology in that way, I'm guessing they can go through BDA Helpline and come through to Technology Committee in that way.
We will get tech questions referred to us by the helpline, and we usually then are able to make an individual contact and try and be as helpful as we can.
Yeah, brilliant. Really appreciate it. Thank you. This next question is, what can parents do if they don't agree with the exam arrangements the school has put in place? Jeff, may I start with you on that one?
I think number one, they have to politely tell the school that that is their opinion. The school will obviously need to know why they think that. So before they go and do that, they need to assemble some kind of description of the evidence which they have that brings them to a different conclusion. Unfortunately, if they and the school don't agree, then in the immediate case of the day of an examination, there isn't a lot you can do. But I think JCQ would be very interested in finding out about that. Lina?
I would say that you would need to refer, obviously start by talking to the SENCO, and if you don't get any joy from that, you perhaps need to go to her line manager or his line manager, and possibly even the person on the governors who's responsible for special needs. That would be the kind of ultimate thing. Yeah. But you do need to have really clear advice why. The regulations are there in order to try and make sure that it's fair across different schools. They're not just, kind of made up for the fun of it. The awarding bodies are aware that different schools would obviously treat students differently, and they're trying to standardise that. Trying to make sure that only students who have writing speeds, for example, below in the below average range, in the bottom 15%, only they qualify, for example, for having extra time to write. Otherwise, there's the danger of people who can afford an assessment, or those who are perhaps in a better situation in a school would get arrangements and others wouldn't, which of course would be completely unfair. It's never going to be completely fair, but the JCQ and the awarding bodies are trying to do their best to make sure that it is fair, and that SENCOs have clear guidance about who should get arrangements and who shouldn't.
Yeah. I think JCQ are very good at recognising when things are not working well. This advice is revised every year and has been for, well, it feels to me like well over 20 years. You know, and every year, you know, they have this new document, and you go through it and you look at all the new things in it and you say, yes, yes. And it's because people have actually said we had a problem.
Yeah,
and
they're very
responsible. Parents, it's schools as well. You know, we cannot do other than the best at that moment and adjust on the basis of the information we get. So if you do have that kind of problem, certainly go through the school. But, you know, at some point, it is important to JCQ know that there has been a problem.
Okay, thank you, experts. And I guess the next one maybe is related in some way. What happens if the school forget to put an arrangement in place and my son has to sit an assessment without it? Experts, who'd like to take that?
Okay.
Well, I'll have a go first. So
yeah, thanks, Gillian.
If the school forget to put an arrangement in place, they can apply for some special dispensation after the examination. But I guess what I would urge parents to do is talk to your children when they come home to, you know, just check, have you had your access arrangements? Contact the school immediately and let them know they didn't get their access arrangements, or maybe they did and you know, there's been some confusion. So have that dialogue with the school. I mean, in reality, schools are well-oiled machines now when it comes to exams, although we're in an unusual situation this year. They've got identified lists of who those children are that are having access arrangements, what those children are having. Everything's laid out ready and waiting for children when they arrive at that point of exam. But of course, we have to take into consideration this year it's slightly different. So yeah, good dialogue with the school, good dialogue with your children.
Gillian, is it worth checking before to make sure in some way? Can parents check in that way? I don't know.
I would say yes, you can. You can contact the school SENCO. In reality, the school should have included you in that process anyway. So you should have had a letter at least saying these are the access arrangements that your child has qualified for. And so you would have that knowledge prior to the children going into exams. But yes, you can check with the school SENCO. Is it already waiting? What will they have to do? So, you know, in things like some of the access arrangements where, for instance, it's a prompt. So, you know, perhaps children might need to have some real input from the school on how do they access that prompt? How does it happen? You know, or a rest break. What does that look like in reality? We can't just rely on the children to say, I need a rest break now. So, you know, they have to practice those. It has to be something that they know how to access, and they're accessing anyway in their normal way of working. So yeah, conversations are always good. Jeff, over to you.
I mean, you've just raised something which I regularly put in my reports, and that is that this candidate should have practice at using the permitted access arrangements so that they're not disadvantaged by unfamiliarity. And I think, you know, we touched on this a little bit before when Lina was talking about people having access arrangements, you know, who don't need it. It's actually a disadvantage to have extra time if you don't need it, because you're sat there wondering what you're doing, you know, and so on. So I think, you know, it is important that when you have something like this, you get used to using it. So, you know, usual ways of working is not just historic, it's actually during exams and exam preparation.
Thank you. Any more comments on that, Caroline?
Yes, I'll chip in there. So
yeah, great.
if a student genuinely should have had an arrangement and it was missed somehow, then there, as Gillian mentioned, there is the option of what they call spec cons or special consideration. Again, if you Google JCQ special consideration, you'll find a booklet which actually lays out under what circumstances you might get an extra few marks. And the absolute maximum is 5%. So it's not going to get you from a low grade up to a high grade, but it might just bump you over the next boundary. So it is worth pointing that out to the school. And when the exams officer fills in the form, they can fill in a form, and most of them are actually online now with the awarding bodies asking for special consideration. That would be one of the things that they could say he should have qualified. He qualified for an access arrangement, didn't get it. And there are other things like maybe a bereavement just coming up to the exam series of a close family member. It could be that I once heard about a bird getting into the exam room and flying around the exam room. Of course, everyone got distracted there, so that was put in as a special consideration. It probably got the whole room 1 more mark, so it's not a lot. It's just a small consideration of the difficulty that you had, and it can't. Special consideration can never make up for example, I'm often asked, you know, my son or daughter was ill for part of year 11. SpecCon can't help with that. The key is that the student knew what they knew, they were well prepared for the exam, and for some reason they couldn't demonstrate that. So this student who didn't get their access arrangement, you know, they should have had a reader, they couldn't demonstrate what they knew because they weren't able to access the paper through their reader. But it can't make up for not knowing something in the first place. It's just there to help overcome it in a small way, something that meant the student who knew the subject but couldn't quite demonstrate what they knew.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Next question. I heard that this summer the teacher assessed grades will be based on a whole mix of evidence, including coursework, classwork and some formal assessments. So my question is, can my dyslexic son just be assessed on his coursework and classwork and not the teacher assessment? Caroline, I think we'll start with you on that one, if that's okay.
I think you've misunderstood what a teacher assessment is. The teacher assessment is the whole thing. All of these things that you've listed. The teacher makes an assessment based on coursework, classwork, we say formal assessments, they're not formal in the same way, as I explained earlier, as exams would normally be, where papers are completely unseen. But the teacher will do their assessments based on many of those things. So I guess perhaps what you mean is, could they not take into account the papers that the awarding bodies have set and are being taken under fairly formal conditions? I'm guessing that's probably what you need, what you mean. That again would be up to the school. If your son or daughter does particularly badly in a formal assessment and the teacher feels that they've got lots of other evidence that shows that that's not a representative grade for the student, they should take that into account. But I don't think you can say to a teacher you should do a formal assessment, but not take it into account. That would be up to the school to make the decision. And it's right if there are going to be teacher assessments, that as much evidence can be put together as possible. And we're bereft of evidence really this year. Teachers are going to have less things to base their teacher assessment on than usual, and actually ruling out one particular kind of assessment I think would be detrimental. It's going to be very, very difficult to have fair grades this year, and you're probably aware that there's considered to be huge grade inflation last year, and if anything it's going to be even worse this year. So we need to do everything we can to make sure that grades are fair.
Thank you, Caroline. Any other comments on that one from our experts? No? Are we okay? We'll move on. We'll squeeze one more question in before we round everything up. It's gone so quick this evening. My son is terrible at spelling. Is he going to lose marks in the exams? Experts who'd like to take that one.
Simple answer, yes, because spelling is given quite a high volume significance, not just in English, but in other subjects where writing at any length is relevant to the testing procedure. SPAG, as it's called, spelling, punctuation and grammar, was upgraded to about 20% of the mark in English. And I'm afraid if you are dyslexic and find spelling nigh on impossible, you may as well accept that your mark is going to not include much credit for your spelling. But don't despair of getting something if you can spell many of the more common words.
Mm-hmm.
You don't suddenly dip to nothing because you get difficult words wrong.
There's two kinds of spelling difficulty. There's spelling that's incorrect, and there's spelling that's illegible. And actually, if you can come up with what are reasonable phonic approximations, you can read what the person is trying to say, even if it's not correct. Actually, you're not going to do too badly. The key is that you can communicate with the examiner. If your spelling is so bizarre that you can't communicate with the examiner, then you've got a problem. And there are things that can be done about that. You can have a human being write for you. You can have you can dictate to your computer. So there are things, but you may well lose a few marks if an adult has done the spelling for you. And of course, that would be right. That's absolutely right. It would be wrong, wouldn't it? If there's marks for spelling and someone else has done the spelling for you, an adult's done the spelling for you, or your computer has done the spelling for you, it would be wrong if you got those marks. That would be unfair. But there are ways around it. But the real problem with spelling is when a student can't come up with something that the examiner can read, even if it's incorrect.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Any other comments before we round our session up, experts, on that one? No? Are we okay? Fantastic. So that just leaves me to thank you all and everybody who's listening to this. Thank you so much from us here at the British Dyslexia Association. Please do keep in touch with us from our national helpline. As Jeff identified, we also have local associations dotted around the country too. So I'd like to round up then, beyond saying a huge thank you to the experts. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us this evening. Is similar to what we did at the beginning, a round robin, but just going round, I guess, just to think about any thoughts really from the things that we've discussed this evening. So Helen, if I can start with you, any thoughts to leave our listeners with, please?
I think the only thing we need to say is that in schools where they do some kind of formal assessment next term, if you want to help children with revision, it's important that you find out from the school what they're covering, because it won't be the entire syllabus, because different schools will have done different things. So where teachers are giving people specific things to revise, those are really the areas for those children to concentrate on, rather than perhaps looking at, other areas and doing their own work.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Jeff, any final thoughts?
I think the final thought I would give is it's not too late to raise an issue that you are concerned about. It is important that you talk with the schools, that you communicate with them about what you have observed whilst you've had the children at home particularly, and that you raise these issues with them. Sometimes you will not be able to resolve the issues in time or at all. But if you don't raise them, they never will be resolved. And I think the primary issue here is not to generate anxiety in the children, in the candidates, but to actually be supportive of them. But don't not tell them what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Malcolm, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Following Jeff's comment about trying not to make candidates overly anxious, I would want to just say to everyone, parents and candidates, the system is designed to be benign. It's not designed to find out your faults and point at you and say, you're not good enough. It's trying to find your strengths. It's trying to give you credit for them. And so go and do your best, and you will be awarded credit for that best.
Brilliant. Thank you, Malcolm. Gillian, any final thoughts?
Well, Jeff nabbed my point. So I've been quickly
You should have given me
paddling.
a heads up to come to
I
you
know,
first,
come
Gillian.
to me first. So I'm paddling quickly to think, what can I say? What can I say? Parents, empower yourselves. That's what I think. Basically, empower yourselves by finding out, asking those key questions, reading the JCQ regulations, heavy reading. It's not to take on holiday, but it contains a lot of information. Think about what you know about your child and make sure you have that dialogue with the school and ask them the key questions. What are they doing? How are they going to support your child? And what can you do as their parents to support your children as well?
Thank you, Gillian. And Caroline, last but not least, any final thoughts?
Yes, a couple of things. Ofqual published a blog, which I'll read the title to you. Feeling worried about grades this year is understandable. Here are some things that might help. And I may have already done so, but if not, Donna, I'll send the link over to you. I don't know whether we could get that out to listeners.
Yes, we can. So we'll put all the information we've talked about on the BDA's website, and I guess in a news item, maybe, Helen, we can put it on there for everybody. So yes, please send it through to us at BDA, and we'll put it on there.
I'll do that.
Sounds brilliant, actually.
Also, so that might be useful for I'm sure parents are feeling anxious as well as their sons and daughters. We've got a document which is guidelines for candidates, which just summarises each of the main access arrangements. And we know that many of our centres actually make that available to the parents. Some of you may even have been sent it. So I will also send that to you, Donna, and you're welcome to put that on on your website for people to download. And this may not sound like good news, but do remember that if your son or daughter is not happy with their grades, they do have the option to retake in the autumn term. That may not thrill them, but there is still that option. If they feel that that they were hard done by, they didn't quite get the grades that they should have done, there will be the option to actually take a proper exam, whoopee, in the autumn term. So.
Thank you. And thank you to all our experts. I think the message there is that there's one very much of hope, and that's obviously what we're here at BDA and our local associations and Communicated to make sure that we support. So that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to everybody on our panel and our listeners. Thank you so much. We may have another one of these pop-ups, who knows? But we've got through so much tonight, guys. Really appreciate it. And as Caroline said, she's going to send us some more information. We will make sure it's on our BDA website homepage. We're getting lots of thank yous in the chat box, which is brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving up a Friday evening in this way. So that just leaves us to say goodbye to you all from here at the British Dyslexia Association. Thank you so much. Take care and keep in touch. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.